Hi everyone, this is Mindy Eggen for Scrapbook and Cards Today magazine, and today I'm excited to share inspiration with you using the new Let's Stamp Together kit featuring Gina K Designs products. First, I wanted to do a quick walkthrough of this subscription kit because it is super cute and I love how this came packaged in this little pocket. So this is the stamp set and coordinating dies that are included. There's also this postcard with a design on it. Then we have a sheet of masking magic, which I will be using in the video today. And I love that it already has this seam on the back, so it's easy to peel apart. And then we have a stencil that has this great design on here. It has a floral image, the leaves, and the center to the flowers. The first thing I'm going to do to get started is I am going to take this masking magic sheet and I am going to trim it down into kind of some thick strips. I didn't measure them out completely. I just know that I wanted to have some pieces to be able to mask off on my stencil. So I'm trimming those down, and then on my last piece, I'm going to trim them down into kind of small rectangles because there are some small areas on the stencil that I'm going to want to block off and protect. Now that I have those pieces ready, I'm going to move on to do some ink blending. I'm starting with the stencil that's included in that kit, and I have a piece of layering weight cardstock from Gina K Designs, which is super smooth and one of my favorite cardstocks for ink blending. I placed that stencil and the cardstock on a make art station. This is just what I prefer to ink blend on because I really love how the magnets hold my stencil down, but you use whatever you prefer to use for your stenciling and ink blending. Now I want to protect the rest of my card. I have a tendency of getting a little carried away with ink blending, and since I already know this about myself, I'm protecting those edges with that masking magic that I trimmed down. I have some turquoise sea ink here from Gina K Designs that I like to place in my ink stand that holds my cover and my ink pad so it's not sliding around or transferring ink onto my work surface. Then I'm picking up some of that ink with my blending brush, and in some circular motions, I'm going to apply that ink through that floral stencil, and I do go in both directions. I kind of do my circular motion from left to right and right to left to make sure I have good coverage. Then I can remove the magnet and lift up my stencil, and I have this really soft floral design on the front of my card. One thing I really love about using the masking magic for kind of masking off my edges is that it will not rip my paper. I have never had this rip my paper. So now that I'm moving my stencil towards more of the center of the card, I need to protect the areas all around it. I don't want to risk getting any of my ink onto the leaves or just off on the edges. So that is where these smaller pieces are coming in. I'm just placing them over the leaves and those little flower centers and things just to protect all of those areas. I'm using the masking magic to mask off these areas because I still had mine in the kit, but if you don't have any or you've already used it, you could use scratch paper or post-it tape, post-it notes, whatever you are comfortable with using, or if you feel you don't need any. I just personally know that I tend to over ink blend my areas, so I just want to protect my surface as much as possible. I once again picked up some ink from my ink pad and I'm blending it onto that flower. Now, a lot of times you will see me tap off on my work surface with that ink, and that's because I just don't want to come in too harsh. I can always add more ink if I feel it's too light. I can't take it away if I come in too dark. And for this particular background, I wanted to do light. So I'm continuing to move across my card. I did speed this part up a little bit. So if you are working along with me, you can always pause the video, but I just sped this up because I'm repeating those same processes and it does actually go pretty quick. Each time I'm just lifting up the stencil, shifting it to a new position and blending on that color. And I do have a few flowers that are going to hang off the edge of the cardstock. After I have my background completely filled with these flowers, I am going to just carefully remove that post-it tape and I will be reusing it. You can reuse these multiple times. Then I'm going to show you how I clean my stencil. There are still a few elements on here that I want to use, and I am one where I definitely clean things as soon as I'm done using it. Now I have a spritzer bottle that I have filled with isopropyl alcohol, and I just spritz that on the stencil on my cloth I have there and wiped it down. That's going to clean up the ink nicely, and now I'm ready to move on to my next area that I'm going to stencil, which is the center of the flowers. So once again, I applied that Post-it tape. I'm just reusing what I had already trimmed out, and now I'm applying the sweet corn ink from Gina K Designs to the center. In most cases, I didn't need to re-ink my blending brush. I picked up enough the first time around that I can just use that same brush and add some color to the centers. I will continue to do this in all the centers of the flowers. You can see that I'm never ripping my paper when I'm lifting this off. And even though it may seem hard on camera, in person, once you put that center closer to your cardstock, it's a lot easier to see the center of the flower to line that up. Once again, I am just spritzing on some of that alcohol, wiping that down with my towel, and now I'm ready to move on to my last piece that I'm going to ink blend, which are these little groupings of circles. I thought this was a really great element to kind of fill in some of those empty spaces, all totally optional, but I saved this one for last because I'm using the Gina K Designs Obsidian ink. Now this one, it's the amalgam ink. You can use black onyx or any other black ink, but this one, I just always grab amalgam. The thing with amalgam is that it does stay wet a little bit longer, so you just want to make sure not to kind of swipe your hand across it or smear it in any way. Give it a little bit of time to dry before you really press down on anything. So I definitely made sure that I had these areas really masked off because I definitely did not want to get any of that black ink anywhere else but in that little stenciled area. I actually ink blend with black quite a bit, so I have a dedicated blending brush just for the black ink. I continued to move this into any open areas between the flowers just to fill in those areas a little bit. After this panel is completely done, I'm going to move it over into my Misty stamping tool to do my stamping. Now, this I found kind of by accident, this playful look that I'm going to do. These are the flowers on the stamp set that line up with the stencil image. When I originally was playing with this kit just to see what it was like, what it would look like, I didn't line my images up correctly and it offset. And it ended up looking really cool. So I thought this was a really fun way to get another use out of this where instead of lining everything up perfectly, purposely misalign it and it's going to come out very whimsical and playful. Kind of, I don't want to say doodle, but just very playful. So when I placed this stamp over my image, the only thing I lined up was the centerpiece. Then I cleaned it. And then I dried that with my hand, just rubbed my hand over it because we don't want any excess water over it. It's not going to do well on top of our ink blended image. It's going to leave little water spots, and I didn't want that in my card today. I'm going to ink my image up really well with the Obsidian Amalgam ink and stamp this down, making sure to really press in the center because that's where the really fine detail is. After I lift the door of the Misty, I have some little happy fingers dance because I love how this came out. It almost looks like there's two layers to the flower because we have some white areas, we have some blue areas, and I just really love how that's stamped. I need to align my flower over the rest of my images, so I did wipe it down with a tidy towel. I dried the stamp by just pressing my hand over it to make sure there's no moisture left on it, and then placed it over my next image and inked this up with that obsidian ink. Now later on, I'm going to show you another trick to kind of protect your area in case you don't dry your stamp very well, and I'll show that in just a bit. But I'm stamping this down, making sure I'm pushing really hard. You could also use an acrylic block for this. I just kind of use the Misty as my security blanket so that if I need to stamp it again, I can. I moved my cardstock to the top of my Misty so that I can stamp off of the card front. Once again, I cleaned it, dried it, and then lined it up over this image to stamp it down. Now this one, I believe when I was lining up my stamp, I think I did get a little bit of moisture on the front of my card. Not sure if I noticed it in the end, but I did end up getting a little moisture there. So I stamped the other flower off screen, and I'm going to show you a trick for this. Now you can use acetate or even clear packaging from your stamp set. I'm bringing in this transparency grid sheet that I have. I really don't need the grid right now. It's just something that protects the front of my card while I'm placing my stamp over my ink blended image. Then I can just remove that and stamp it down. Now you can also stamp on top of some scratch cardstock if you're worried that you don't have your stamp free of that moisture from cleaning it. So I really love how this all came out from this little happy accident that I did. And it kind of gives you a new view on lined images for your florals. So try that. I think this is very fun and playful and just gives you more for your stamp set. I'm going to move on to working on the sentiment for my card. So I have a circle die here. This gives a stitched edge that I'm die cutting from black onyx cardstock. And I set that off on the side. I'm taking this word thankful, that's from the stamp set in the kit, and I'm going to stamp this on layering white cardstock using my amalgam obsidian ink. I'm going to need this stamped and die cut out in order to line up my smaller sentiment that I'm going to be heat embossing on that black circle. So I stamped this down onto that cardstock, and the reason I'm using the layering weight is just because it's all going to match so that it's all consistent throughout my card. And since these do have kind of a thicker font to it, I am going to go ahead and stamp that again so it is a really crisp black. Now, because the amalgam ink does stay wet for a little bit longer, I'm going to take my heat tool, and I have a high and low setting on my heat tool, and just using that low setting, I'm just going to quickly go over this to help dry that. I don't want to warp the cardstock, I just want to dry that ink. And then I can line up the coordinating die, hold it in place with a low tack tape, and get this die cut out. Now I'm ready to do my heat embossing, and this is where I needed this die cut out, as I needed to figure out the placement of my smaller sentiment that is going to go on this black circle. So once I have that lined up, I picked that up with the Dora the Misty, and I'm prepping my cardstock with an anti-static powder tool. I do have a little bit of tape runner behind my circle so it doesn't move, and one of my all-time favorite ways to white heat emboss, and this is a trick that I learned from Gina, is by stamping in white pigment ink. Now I am just barely dabbing the ink pad onto that sentiment, because if you push too hard with pigment ink, it's going to get that ink seeped in between the letters, and you don't want that. When I'm stamping down, I'm also giving a very, very gentle touch to stamp it down, or you'll squish your sentiment and then it'll distort it and you won't be able to read it. So there is a little bit of a learning curve with it, but I have used this so many times. It is giving me such amazing results. It just takes a little practice. After I heat set that and let that cool, I like to buffer over the top with a Swiffer cloth just to remove any excess powder from the front of the circle. We are in the home stretch of creating this card. I'm taking my panel and I am going to trim this down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. Whenever I do this and I'm using a paper trimmer, I actually just trim 1/4 of an inch off of each side. That way I can have some areas, the flowers kind of bleeding off the edge to give it a more realistic look to a handmade background. Gina also has master layouts that create this as well if you prefer to die cut. I just quickly used my paper trimmer. Now in true Gina style, since this is her kit, I trimmed out a piece of black onyx cardstock that measures about 1/8 of an inch bigger than my front panel. So it's going to leave that very, very thin strip, and I went ahead and attached those two pieces together with my dot runner. I personally like to add a little bit of dimension to my panels, so I have a piece of a double-sided foam, and I'm going to trim that down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and I remove the release paper on one side, place that over my black panel, and then I remove the release paper on the other side, and I'm going to place this on top of a card front that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Now to finish this off, I have my circle with my heat embossed sentiment that I'm adding dot runner to, and I'm going to place this on the front of my card. Now, one of the reasons I'm going to flip this and place it on the other end is when I place this over that flower, it looked like a peacock tail. So I turned my cardstock to go the other way, which is why I didn't attach this to a card base yet. So now I can place this down in that left-hand corner, which is where I like to put my sentiments. And then once I press down, that dot runner is going to attach permanently to the front of my card. Now I had a couple strips of that double-sided foam left over from before, so I placed that behind my thankful word and then added that to the front of the circle. Now, this is actually a recreation of a card I created previously. The card you see in the picture is this one on the right where I added some crystal lacquer to the little dots, and I also have some jewels in the center of my flowers. Those are all totally optional if you wanted to step it up and add some sparkle to the front of the card. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this has inspired you and gives you another look at your floral image to create some playful and whimsy looks. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.